It's really lovely to be back. Sadly, from a family point of view, I'm solo today. James is unwell and he's at home with his mum. And Caroline is donning the camouflage uniform, doing her annual tick the boxes and do the fitness tests weekend down in Holsworthy. So prayers for her as she swelters down there in the heat. I'm joined today by a good friend of mine, Mosen, so he's bolstering the Ingram numbers, if not in name, and certainly in presence. Last year, we did a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the prophets, and it was very hard for me to keep track, so I can only imagine how difficult it was for you. One week we're in Isaiah, the next week we're in Jeremiah, the next week we're somewhere else, and so I thought it was best to be a little more focused with what we're doing for the first half of this year, and I think a really good place to start is Romans. So this is an intro, if you like, to Romans, and then over the next 6 or 7 months, we'll delve into that wonderful book, that wonderful letter in a lot more detail, and hopefully that gives us a bit more continuity and a bit more focus. Paul's letter to the Romans is undoubtedly his greatest work. It could also be argued that it's the greatest letter ever written. John, if he were here, might want to argue that clarification. I'll admit Revelation also has a horse in the which is the best letter race, but clearly this letter to the Romans is one of the most important letters ever written and one of the most important parts of the Bible. Paul makes it very clear what's going on with the good news. And we're going to go into a lot more detail about this in subsequent sermons, but from the outset it's really important to think about what Paul was trying to do. For about the last 1,000 years, the theology of the good news has been distilled down into cherry-picking bits and pieces from the New Testament. Paul goes to the heart, though, of what the good news really means. He doesn't discard anything. He doesn't discard the Old Testament. He doesn't discard the parts of the message from Jesus that we need to hear. At the heart of what Paul's talking about is God created us for companionship with him. And then he sent his son, despite all the sin that he knew he was going to encounter, so he could have that companionship. The point of our lives as human beings isn't to be born, be a sinner, be saved, die, and then go to heaven. That would be an utter waste of all the rest of this creation. We're going to find out over the next 6 or 7 months that the point of us being human, the point of the creation of humanity, is that we might share this beautiful creation with him throughout our lives. And that through Jesus bringing the kingdom down, we have the privilege, the right, through grace, to do that right now. Being a letter that was written 2,000 years ago, there were formal structures that Paul needed to follow when writing this letter to the Romans. You can pretty much sum up today's reading with 2 sentences. The first is in verse 1. He's introducing himself. Hi, I'm Paul. I'm a slave to Jesus. And then his second thing he needs to do as an introduction is tell who the letter's to. To all who love God, grace to you and peace. That's it in a nutshell. Great. Sermon over. But seriously, why did Paul need to have 7 verses when he could have done it in 2? The thing is, he needed to explain the purpose of the letter as well. He had these followers in Rome, some of whom he knew, but most of whom he didn't. But he wanted everybody to know this is a letter that boils down to one thing. It boils down to the gospel. It boils down to the good news. And to do this, he needs to point out three things so that he's sure that everybody's on the same page from the beginning. First, Jesus is the true Son of God. Second, Jesus is King. Not only of Rome, now that is controversial in itself, given that Caesar also believed that he was divinely appointed. Not only is he King of Rome, he's King of the whole world. And he will claim the world for his Son, Jesus Christ, by sending out his apostles, of which Paul is one, to spread the good news. Jesus is the Son of God. He is the King. But Paul, and as we'll find out later, all of us have been called to spread that good news. And what good news it is. Jesus is the Messiah the world was waiting for. We've talked about this before, that there was at least a 400-year wait. From when the last of the prophets said there will be a Messiah to when the Messiah came. He was exactly what God promised. He is the Son of God. Verse 2 begins, the gospel he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures regarding his Son, who, as to his earthly life, was a descendant of David, and who through the Spirit of his holiness was appointed the Son of God in power by his resurrection from the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord. Paul says in verse 3 that Jesus is a descendant of David. He's planting a flag. There's this 1,000 years of history in Jesus' royal line. Beat that, Caesar. But Paul isn't just having a dig at Caesar. He's drawing on Psalm 2, Samuel 2, and countless other places where they speak of the King who would come, who would be God's Son. Time and time and time again, not just in this book, but in all his writings. Paul says Jesus is King. He's the true King, and he's here. Paul knows he's playing a dangerous game because he's asking the Christians in Rome to make a choice. Choose Jesus, the true King, not Caesar. Jesus' resurrection is the beginning of the resurrection of the dead for which the Jews have been waiting. They've been longing. It's a sign that the power of all the tyrants and the bullies who've kept them down, who've killed them, who've repressed them, who've enslaved them for thousands of years. Death came into the world with the fall, and it's been used against Israel for thousands of years in one way or another. But Jesus has broken death's claim. I taught the kids in Caroline to play a card game over the Christmas holidays. When I was a kid, grew up on a sheep farm, and most of the time Dad didn't take holidays. He was far too busy doing one thing or another, shearing or drenching or mulesing or goodness knows what else. There's always something to do on a farm. But the 2 weeks every year, normally over Christmas and New Year, we'd pack up the boat, we'd pack up the Land Cruiser, and we'd drive for 2 or 3 hours down into Victoria to this place called Tamboon, which was a lake that you could only get to by boat. And then Dad would relax and we would relax. The days would always start the same. We'd get up, we'd either go fishing, or if it wasn't windy, we'd go water skiing. And we'd come home and have breakfast. And then for most of the rest of the day, we'd just read and play cards. And most of the time, the card game that we played was a game called Euchre. And so this is the game that I taught Caroline and the kids over Christmas. Some of you may know the game. It's similar to 500. It's kind of a cheap less cerebral version of 500. It's a game of suits though. You've got the 4 suits and one suit gets drawn out and that's the powerful suit. And generally speaking in euchre, aces are high. So like Caesar in Rome, aces normally win. If you're holding an ace, then often you're holding a winning hand, and that's how Caesar was. He was the ace. But you see, there's another thing that goes on in euchre. Those of you that play it will know where I'm going with this. The 2 jacks, the jack of the trumps and the jack of the same colour, are called bowers, and they beat an ace. The jack of the trumps is the right bower. Nothing beats the right bower. And in Jesus, Paul's telling us you've got a bower. Not just a bower, but a handful of bowers, which if you play the game, you know is impossible, but bear with me. With a handful of bowers, you can't lose a trick and you can't lose the hand. You've always got a winning hand. But it's not just me. It's not just you. Paul's also saying, in Jesus, we've all got a handful of bowers. An unbeatable hand with a pedigree that stretches back 3,000 years. With Jesus, you can't lose. So why do we lose? I lose every day, and you lose every day. Why do we lose? Why do we behave? Not like people who have a handful of bowers, but people who have a handful of sevens. Can you imagine the frustration that God feels? His final act was to send his only son and to cheapen himself and dirty himself by exposing himself to the squalor of sin on earth. But before that, he gave us a breastplate. He's covered us with armour. He's filled us with the Spirit, surrounded us with a fortress, and then sent his son. And we still play like we've got a losing hand. Why? Paul touches on this in verse 5. Faith. Something I'm realising as I'm going through my theology studies, faith is much easier to preach than it is to live. You see, Paul says that obedience comes from grace, and from obedience, faith. That's the conundrum for us as human beings. Because as we all know, obedience doesn't sit well with the free will that God also gave us. Often it's a case of my will or your will, God, as we've talked about a few times today already. In order to find faith, we have to be obedient first. Verses 5 to 7 of our reading today claim the whole world, the King Jesus. And that includes the Christians in Rome, to whom the letter's addressed. Verse 5 begins, "Through him we receive grace and apostleship to call all the Gentiles to the obedience that comes from faith, for his name's sake. And you are also among those Gentiles who are called to belong to Jesus Christ, to all in Rome who are loved by God and called to be his holy people." It seems pretty clear here that while Paul has addressed this letter to his church in Rome, he's not just speaking to that church. It seems pretty clear that the audience is much wider, and really it seems obvious in hindsight that he wrote the letter not only for those in his time, but for every Christian that was to follow. There's a giveaway here to what's going on in Paul's mind when he's writing the letter. And it's the fact that he's used one word twice in this introduction. The word is Gentiles. It suggests that this letter is for everyone then and it's for everyone now. Because quite often when Paul's speaking, he'll put the world in two camps, Gentiles and followers of Jesus. There are only two groups in the world according to Paul. The powerful wording that he uses, who are called to belong to Jesus Christ, also indicates this isn't just some general advertisement that Paul's writing. It's not something that he's saying, look, this is a product or a way of life that you might or might not want to buy, depending on how you're feeling at the time. It's more like a command. I know more than you know, and I know that you'll be foolish if you resist what I'm suggesting you do. If you put it in the perspective of everyone else in Rome, those who weren't followers of Jesus, you can kind of understand how silly it is that you would think that you might have a choice about what Paul's talking about. Imagine Caesar's minions walking around Rome saying, Caesar's Lord. And if you feel the need to have a Roman kind of experience, a Roman kind of ruler, you might want to submit to Caesar. It didn't work like that in Rome, did it? According to Caesar, he was divinely appointed and you didn't have a choice. And Paul's saying, as a follower of Jesus, you don't have a choice either. The challenge of Paul's whole letter to the Romans, and this sometimes calls Paul's gospel, because as I said at the beginning, that goes to the heart of Paul's message here, is that someone very different to Caesar has come along. He's exercising a very different kind of power. He is the world's true Lord, the Son of God. Now, it's going to take all 16 chapters of Romans to unpack that and find out what it means to live that. But that is the message. Can you think of anything else in history that has changed the world as much as what Jesus' death on the cross did? Gunpowder was pretty important to the world. The AK-47 has killed at least 20 to 30 million people, according to historians. And if you add artillery and shells from tanks and shells and explosives and bombs, gunpowder has been incredibly important to the world, good or bad, it's been important. Maybe it's touched 100 million people. On the flip side, penicillin, God thank you, has saved probably a couple of 100 million. But still, that's a small part of humanity. Aeroplanes and the internet have brought the world so much closer. But there's so much more going on with Jesus. Before Jesus, and to be honest, after him, for those who don't follow him and don't pronounce him as king, leadership in the world was largely what Samuel warned in 1 Samuel 8, and I'm paraphrasing here, but Samuel was told by God, a king will take away your sons and daughters. He will take away a tenth. Let's be honest, today it's more like half of all your grain and all your livestock, and you will be his slaves. That was the warning that God gave to the people of Israel when they were yearning for a king before the one true king. So when we think about 100 million people that have been touched by gunpowder, or 200 million or so that have been touched by penicillin, and then we think about more than 1 billion people whose lives have been changed because of the message of Jesus, and the 7 billion or so whose lives could be changed but haven't yet, that's the magnitude of what Jesus did. That's the magnitude of the new King. Something we'll uncover time and time again through Paul's gospel, and I touched on this at the beginning, is the change of the focus of the good news that Paul's talking about. From Thomas Aquinas onwards, and really only up until the last 50, maybe 100 years, the focus that we as human beings have taken away from the Bible has been about us. What should we do now? Think about Leviticus and all the instructions. How we've been blessed from Abraham all the way through. And then the joy that will come to us afterwards. Many of us like to sit in that place in Revelation and think about the glory that there's going to be when we're one with God again. But Paul's saying it isn't about that. It isn't about this narrative that we are born, we are sinners, we are saved, we die, we go to heaven. Paul's saying that totally misses the point. God created this amazing, statistically impossible world. And then he created us in his image, and he put us in this world as stewards over this world. And then he realised with this free will that he couldn't have the companionship with us that he wanted. So he sent his Son into the world to die for us so that we could be with him here again. What's the point? What's Paul saying? The point is God wants to be with us here right now. He doesn't want to wait until you die. He wants to be with us here right now. That's why he sent Jesus. That's why the King is so important. He's already in the room. He's already in your home. He wants to see you every day, every minute, not just now at 9:30 on Sunday. But what about those of us, or those we know, who don't know Jesus? There's at least 7 billion of those people in the world. Now, Paul's very clear about what he sees his role as. He went from being the arch sinner, and he admits that. He says, we're all sinners, of which I am the worst. And Jesus has taken Paul from that to be the apostle, to spread the gospel, not amongst the Jews. No, that would be too easy. Paul's given the hardest task of all. Go and spread the gospel to the Gentiles, to the 7 billion. But this isn't just reminding us about Paul's task, Paul's calling, Paul's role. It's a reminder of Jesus' great commission in Matthew 28. Go, make disciples. Jesus didn't say, come and worship me every Sunday. He said, first seek my righteousness and my heavenly kingdom. And he said, go make disciples. Verses 1 and 2 begin, Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle and set apart for the gospel of God. That's his reason for living. The gospel he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures. But here's the kicker. Here's what I'm talking about. Verse 5 links back to this. Verse 5 says, through him we receive grace and apostleship to call all the Gentiles. We've touched on this a minute ago. Paul mentions the Gentiles twice. It is fundamental to his message. Because he was the disciple that was going to spread the message to the Gentiles. Now, he'd already introduced many of these, and they were part of the church he's talking to in Rome. And he's making it very, very clear that it's only through Jesus' death that he becomes the King and is able to offer us the grace, which when coupled with apostleship, allows us to call those who don't know him. I've just done an apologetics course over summer at summer school. If you ever want to put a bit of a dampener on your Christmas holidays, try doing summer school through it all. When everybody else is having barbecues, you're saying I'll just duck away and do about 10 hours of reading. I tell you what, one of my favourite parts of the Bible is James 1, and I truly lived James 1 over Christmas. It was the hardest subject I've ever done. From learning to count as a 2-year-old, to all the high school, all the uni, it was the hardest thing my brain has ever had to do. It combines philosophy and psychology and physics and metaphysics and chemistry. Apologetics isn't apologising for your Christianity, it's explaining it. What it forces you to do is look inside yourself and understand why you believe what you believe about Jesus. And then it equips you with tools to explain in simple terms to someone who doesn't believe in Jesus, to help them understand in simple terms why it is you believe what you believe. Put it in the language of ordinary people, or in the language of Paul, put it in the language of the Gentiles. Every week we're asked to make a video, just a 1-minute video. Technology isn't my strong suit. You were meant to just use a little button on the side of the screen of the app that they give you to record this 1-minute video, and I couldn't work it out, not once in 12 weeks. So I had to go a different route, and I had to post the video on YouTube and then upload the YouTube link, and that was how I could post this message. And the message was, using the big picture story of God, we've talked about that a few times today, that God created the universe and then he created us and so on, all the way through the fact that we're now saved through Christ. You have to use that big picture of Christianity to then respond to an objection that an atheist might have to your faith. There's too much evil in the world, or there's suffering, or Christians are hypocritical, or whatever it is. Something amazing about going through this process of having to distill in 1 minute, in simple English, a response to that objection is that it made me realise if I was going to be the apostle that Paul tells me I need to be, I needed to be much surer about my own faith. It was like one of those Ford Mustangs that looks okay to begin with, but when the passionate person pulls the Mustang apart, there's a lot more rust inside that Mustang than they think. And my Mustang's still lying in 20 pieces in the garage. It still looks beautiful, it's still a Mustang. But there's a bit of putting back together that still needs to go on. But what it made me do is it made me realise, yeah, this is beautiful. This deserves to be pulled apart, and this deserves to be thought about. I'll tell you what, there's a message from C.S. Lewis here, where he says, if you can't explain something simply, then you don't truly understand. And at the beginning of this process, I didn't truly understand my own faith. You see, the subject has galvanised me. In a world where it's mostly taboo to talk about faith, there are certain clubs, for example, where you can't talk about religion or politics. Certainly at my work, it would be unwise to talk about Christ at the water cooler. But I made it my mission over Christmas to put Christ back where he belongs, at the centre. It's much easier when you're training to be a pastor, because when people say, what do? You can say, oh, I'm training to be a pastor. That opens the door to a conversation about Christ. I'll admit that makes it easier. Something amazing happened. As I was having these conversations over Christmas, mostly it was atheists. Most of the time, we agreed on most of what I believe in. we would park behaviour that neither of us wanted to participate in on the side, and we both agree we don't want to be there. And then we talk most of the conversation about the stuff we wanted to be doing more of. Being kind, being forgiving, being loving, being generous. Where we get to at the end is that even the avowed atheists, even those that were more in the camp of Dawkins than Paul, 90% of what we were talking about we agreed on. And when we concluded the conversations, some of which went for more than an hour, we walked away closer friends, and this Gentile, as Paul would call him, had a lot to think about. And more than once, they would agree when I asked them, perhaps you might consider having a look at the book of Mark, the greatest biography ever written. You want to know why I love Jesus? Go and read Mark. I'm so excited that we're going to really dig into the book of Romans over the next 6 or 7 months. We're going to see together, and I'm learning this as much as you are as we go, why it's the greatest letter ever written. It's going to take us to the heart of who Jesus is. He's the Son of God. He's the King for all. And we're going to learn what him being that King means for us. It means he came to save all humans, everywhere on earth. Here's the hard part. Here's the kicker though. We're going to learn what Jesus asked for in return. When Paul talked about Romans and we in the opening 7 verses of this letter, what he really meant was the Romans and us.